some banana pudding and peanut butter jelly sandwich to your next stop. Please remember to bring some banana pudding and peanut butter jelly sandwich to your next stop.
Hello, welcome to the new Center for Architecture and Environmental Design. It's my pleasure to introduce Sharon Johnston to this great new building. Sharon's firm is doing some very important work, and it's a really wonderful time to have her here. I first got to know Sharon when I was doing a PhD degree at UCLA, and she was one of the prominent faculty members teaching there. Since that time, she and her partner, Mark Lee, have made some of the most exciting, original, post-linguistic and performative design contributions to contemporary architectural culture. As you probably know, Sharon is a founder and principal of the Los Angeles-based architecture studio Johnston Marklee. She has directed collaborative teams of artists, fabricators, and engineers in the design of award-winning projects in North and South America, Europe, and Asia. Among these are a series of iconic houses. These include the Hill House and Vault House in Southern California, and the View House in Rosario, Argentina. She's also currently working on new projects for leading arts institutions, including a renovation of the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, the UCLA Graduate Art Studios campus, and the Menil Drawing Institute in Houston, which is on the campus of the Menil Collection. Johnston Marklee has been recognized with more than 30 major awards. These include 2 Progressive Architecture Awards, 2 American Architecture Awards from the Chicago Athenaeum, and many awards from the Los Angeles AIA. Sharon has lectured, published, and exhibited her work widely, and she has taught design at some really amazing international schools, a few of them the ETH in Zurich, Harvard, the Oslo School of Architecture, Princeton, Rice, SCI-Arc, the Technical University of Berlin, and UCLA. This semester, she's the Frank Gehry Visiting Chair at the University of Toronto. And just last week, Sharon and Mark were named the Artistic Directors of the 2nd Annual Chicago Biennial. This is in 2017. We're really privileged to be hosting Sharon here at this opportune moment when her practice is exploding. There will be time for questions after her lecture. Until then, please join me in welcoming Sharon Johnston.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay, yeah. Thanks for having me. John gave me a really great tour of the campus and of your new building, so it's really an exciting moment. It looks like anyway, it looks like an exciting moment for the school, so it's a great time to be here. It's my first time in Ohio, and so all is good. Anyway, today I'm going to share kind of 3 chapters. My lecture is organized in kind of 3 chapters, which will start with some of the earlier houses that John mentioned, and then the second chapter will look at some of the transitional work that is somewhat institutional in nature, but beginning to look at sort of larger scale projects that encompass maybe more complex programs or sites. And then finally, I'll end with 3 museum projects that are currently in design or under construction. So as John mentioned, our practice is based in LA. Mark and I run a studio of about 20 architects. And I think we've had the chance to work in many places around the world. And as a result, I think you'll see there's quite a diverse body of work and approach to different kinds of projects. But perhaps what unifies, there's a couple kind of general themes that I wanted to create a framework for to present the work. And the first has to do with an interest in sort of core disciplinary issues in architecture, and namely the problem of type in architecture. We began a lot of our projects not necessarily starting with a kind of clear typological organization, but it obsesses our planning and development of each one of our projects. And so the way we like to think about it is more about what we call approximating type, where we begin to look at very key organizational principles that have historic precedent, that help us understand the context around the problem at hand from both a very contemporary lens, but also a historical understanding of ways that other architects have solved that problem. And probably other kind of key kind of umbrella of thinking around each one of our projects has to do with an idea about context. And I don't mean that simply in the sort of contextual response of scale and things, which is of course important, but probably a larger sort of what we call an ecology around a project. And so that we really want to understand both the present condition, the historical condition of that place, kind of qualities and atmospheres of the program, the people that make up each one of our projects. And of course, building in Southern California, we are obsessed with Banham and his understanding of the sort of ecologies of LA, and we're slowly ticking off each one of those types from the plain, the beach, the hillside, and we have yet to do a house for a car, but we're hoping that's just right around the corner. So this just quick slideshow gives you a sense of kind of the breadth of work we're doing, and I wanted to start, as I mentioned, with a couple of houses. This is the Hill House. It's on a hillside. I don't know, is there a pointer here? If not, it's okay, but if there is, maybe you guys could bring one up. In any case, the Hill House is in Santa Monica Canyon, it's a quite kind of famous area of Los Angeles for architecture, and the Hill House, which is that white square, is about 100 yards from the Eames House, which is probably the most famous residential building in Southern California. So the pressure was on, but we were working not on a beautiful flat parcel, but one of the steepest buildable lots in Southern California. That's what you get when you're a young architect in Los Angeles. But in any case, there's incredibly strict legislations about building on parcels like this in Los Angeles, so you are faced with reams and reams of volumes with diagrams like what you see on the top image there that tell you how to fit a house, a traditional idea of what a house is on a steep lot. So as an alternative, we began to look at other thinkers, in this case Hugh Ferris, who began to think about a way to sculpt the Manhattan skyline through a set of relational ideas about mass and light and view and air as a way to find a kind of developer model that would also make sense for enhancing the beauty of the city. And so we took literally a very, very pragmatic approach to understanding the hillside. You guys probably are not familiar with this software called FormZ, but this is what we were working on at that time in the early 2000s. And just built a kind of envelope of space that projected from the hillside, so the darker image is the site, and built a buildable envelope based on restrictions of height, and then began to kind of carve back into that all the tectonic and infrastructure problems of structure, access to the car, water drainage, and all of that. And this was the resulting envelope. So a lot of times our work sets out very different kinds of design parameters, kind of maximum or minimum conditions that then we began to sort of overlay and craft together. So concurrent with that research, we were also looking at the kind of volumetric organization of the house, looking at how we could occupy that buildable envelope through assembling all of the rooms. And then there was a process of erasure where we began to look at the kind of continuities of space that could really take advantage of the section. We work a lot in models, and these models are both for structure, for form, for volume. In this case, one of the key things we're looking at is apertures, which are another key part of the way we develop all of our buildings, which is particularly evident in the house projects. And they do a lot of work, of course, bring in light and air, but really help us develop a strong response to the environmental conditions. So in the upper right, that's along the street, and it's a really loud street, so there's no windows, and of course the contrasting side on the east, looking towards the view, the volume almost completely dematerializes through the placement of the windows. So this is the finished house. It's clad in a material called grail coat. So we, in our early projects, didn't have a lot of opportunity to develop rich material palettes, but this material was important for us because it could work on the wall and the roof equally and was a seamless material. So it captured that sort of sense of mass and continuity between all planes of the building. And then in contrast to that kind of sense of mass on the exterior was this very kind of volumetric, lofted feeling on the interior, that the windows opened and it had this very kind of visual continuity and atmospheric continuity with the site around it. This is a concrete cast-in-place wall that then is clad with grail coat. This is, according to our structural engineer, the hardest wall he's ever engineered because it's at a 45-degree slope, or angle to the slope, and so just shoring this wall was a real challenge. But ultimately, its kind of integration with the tectonic and kind of order of the hillside made it a really efficient structure to build and to engineer. So interior-wise, there's kind of no visible structure except for this stair element, which is the central core around which both sides of the house are cantilevered. So here it gives you a sense of how we began to carve away kind of walls and divisions in the house so that it has a very kind of volumetric atmosphere that's filled with light, alternative views that really, I think, express this three-dimensional section, and three levels of the house. As we were developing this project, I think we were really kind of excited about the principle that we discovered, that we could sort of take those really banal diagrams that you saw at the beginning and instead propose an alternative, which was kind of rethinking this very site-specific way to map the volumetric envelope of all of these parcels in the canyon. So we did a whole presentation. We went to the city, the zoning department, and made a presentation to the key zoning administrators, thinking they would be thrilled with this new way to write their code. And they weren't that excited, but they did give us approval for our house. So I think we're always looking for both ways to look at the singular object, but understand what that could mean at a larger scale. This image was one that we made in the process of developing the house. And it, of course, includes this canonical image by Julius Schulman. And I think I'll talk a little bit more about this collage technique in a bit, but what was important about this was when the house won some awards and this was published, and some friends of ours knew Julius and said, you better share this with him because he might sue you. You guys have taken this image and you've co-opted it into a kind of conceptual diagram. And so instead of approaching it in a legalistic manner, we took Julius to lunch and he said, I love your house and I want to photograph it. So this is a suite of photographs that he shot a couple years before he passed away. And I think what was fun for us was just kind of seeing the house through his eyes. He was really captivated by it in the way that it had such a site-specific response to the slope. And these images, we used a lot of his furniture he brought to the house, and he really almost thought about it like making a film through the way he worked with light and dark and the kind of sequence of images that he produced of the house. Concurrent with, or just after the Hill House, we had the invitation to develop this project, which is called the View House. It's in Rosario, Argentina, and in a way, this is our sort of suburban, typological suburban house project because it was in an old horse farm that was being redeveloped. And I think in this case, very, in a way, different to the Hill House, it was a plot that was being developed, and we knew that we would have very close neighbors, perhaps not immediately, but in the near future. And so in this case, we we used the kind of organizing principle for us was to try to think about moving through and around the house as a way to deepen the visual and physical relationship of the site, but at the same time create a kind of masking so that there was a sense of privacy for the owners of the house relative to their neighbors. And that, in fact, became an organizing principle for the form of the house, which was, the house is built out of cast-in-place concrete, and we worked with very rural builders in Rosario, Argentina. And so we basically had a limited footprint, and then, which was this sort of primitive of this oval, volumetric oval form that had to do with a number of kind of setback requirements. And then we worked with very primitive subtractions of that form that were based on just planar cuts or volumetric cuts that you can see in the lower diagrams that were based on primitive geometry that we knew all of these builders who were very comfortable building chapels and ceremonial spaces, they would be able to form and execute without too much trouble. So I think what ended up, the resulting form of the house really kind of takes on the traditional notions of front yard, rear yard setbacks. And so there's a kind of continuous movement around the house as you approach it where you're always, there's no kind of singular facade, but it really, in its form, amplifies that kind of lack of hierarchy about the organization. So it's from each orientation, it has a kind of very different sense of how it meets the ground and the kind of sense of weight, heaviness, and lightness. And then I think on the inside, we tend to always look for those moments of where you would expect the most kind of weight and heaviness, where we're solving kind of significant structural problems, and we try to introduce something that contradicts that. So in this case, a skylight. There's a lot of forces coming together at this moment up above the finished ceiling, but by introducing light, it gives it that kind of sense of buoyancy. And those kind of contrasting conditions are always interesting to us. So on the inside, it's maybe in contrast to the heaviness of the mass, it's light-filled, and there's always a relationship between a window or aperture and these kind of cuts or figures or outplanes that kind of interrupt the pure geometry of the volume and become reflectors for light. So that becomes a kind of organizer along with another strategy where we push windows into the volume and take advantage both in terms of shading, so we don't have to have things penetrating past the facade, but also that becomes a kind of poché space for storage and things like that. So here's the diagram of the section and the way that sort of openness works and the apertures. So I'll just flip through a couple of these images that give you a sense of how light and shadow work and how the apertures work in the house. And here's that space that I showed you earlier as a finished space. This is now a bedroom. So some of the rooms are quite defined, and others use the geometry to sort of approximate the sense of enclosure for the room. And then finally, in this kind of panorama, this promenade that organizes the house from the entry and the more public spaces up through the second level, and then the kind of culmination of that experience is this doorway up to the roof. So it's kind of an oversized stair that's sort of a patio, and then at the top of the house, the panorama reveals itself, and you have a sense of a distant view of the neighborhood. And then the kind of third project in this chapter is the vault house, which was finished a couple of years ago and was an exciting proposition for us because, I mean, obviously the beach is such an important part of the landscape of Los Angeles, but it's a very fragile ecology, and there aren't that many opportunities historically where architects have had a chance to explore this as a type. And so this is in Oxnard, so sort of halfway between, let's say, Santa Monica and Santa Barbara, and our parcel was a kind of long, narrow parcel that fortunately had an open space next to it. And so it was a kind of interesting opportunity to think not only about this almost shotgun type, but we had a little breathing room. So here was the diagram for us, and just generally speaking, what we found in visiting a lot of houses in this area and around Southern California, the challenge of this type is that it's a long, narrow footprint. And so the first room, let's say, adjacent to the ocean is quite spectacular, and the rest of the house really could kind of be anywhere. So our first design strategy was to introduce a void in the middle of that space. So it's both an entry space, but it's a space full of light and air, and it sort of creates a sort of reciprocity or an equivalency between the front, western side of the house and the back. And then this was a house for a family that had two daughters, but the girls were away in college, and so there was an to have a really generous house. They could entertain and welcome their family back, but that it had a sense when only the husband and wife were at home that had a real sense of openness and kind of fluidity from the street to the beach. So our approach was to think about a singular room type that we could repeat and scale appropriately, but would kind of fill the entire house. So it had a kind of almost kaleidoscope idea, and that particular volumetric type for us was the vault. And so each one of these volumes of space is oriented in the same direction, and when the house is totally open, you have views all the way through this 150-foot length. So here's a series of sections looking through there from starting at the top left, which is the patio on the beach side and the raised structure that's required for tsunamis. Moving back, living room, master bedroom, the courtyard again, children's bedrooms, and then the garage here in the very back. So there's a moment where it steps down and sits back down on the ground where it's far enough away from the flood zone. So just as a diagram, this was the idea of how all of those views oriented in the same direction would give you that almost kaleidoscopic feeling. Early models that I think capture that idea of the sort of openness of the house. And then we do work a lot in models at various different scales. This was probably a 20-foot long model that you're just seeing a series of cross sections of. What was interesting for us about this project was once we'd figured out this approach, we ended up having to solve a number of different problems where different vaults met. So let's say the second image on the upper tier was what we call a kind of occluded intersection of two vaults. And in other cases where they're sort of just missing each other, and then in other cases it becomes almost more Gothic, let's say in this image here. And our approach was not to kind of smooth out those moments of intersection, but really try to capitalize on them and use them to help us define the spaces in different ways. So from the street side, what was interesting to us is that this approach, both as a kind of figure, as an elevation, was quite contextual in a way. There's a number of sort of historic or more pseudo-Spanish style houses in this neighborhood, so there's a way that this building really fits into its context. And then also ways in which we use this kind of formal approach to carve out voids within the mass to, in this case, offer a more generous entryway for pedestrians and visitors to enter into the courtyard. Here's the opposite view from the ocean side. And so this is the finished house, and as I said, it's raised above the beach for this tsunami zone, so sometimes the sand is much higher than it is in this image, so that's a very kind of fluid landscape on the base. And here's that view with some of our neighbors that you can get a sense of sort of how the building, in a way, has a sort of slightly comfortable relationship with its immediate neighbors. So the idea is that most people would enter through this courtyard, so this is sort of zooming in on this opening, and so the first approach into the building is an open air space, and what's kind of atmospherically special about this is that because it's blocked by wind, it has a real stillness that's kind of contrasting with the space in the front, and so it's actually a space that is probably used the most in the house. So this is looking east towards the street, and then this is the view looking west towards the ocean. And this kind of quick series of images just kind of almost mimics the sliced sections that I showed you before. So this is that view looking out towards the ocean, then looking back. So you really, I think these capture pretty clearly the sort of transparency and the way that the house feels and the way light fills the vaulted spaces of each room. And now we're upstairs in the master bedroom. Typically, this room would be right up at the front of the house, but we really argued that by kind of straddling it between that, having a double-height living room, this space, which was immediately adjacent to the courtyard as well, it both in terms of air, light, and view, had a much more rich environment and kind of helped modulate the scale in a more successful way. So now we're at the other side of the house looking west again. We're on the other side of the courtyard. And I think, for example, here where we turned the vault upside down, we were able to, as opposed to creating a sort of much more complex geometry in the intersection, if the window were oriented the other way, we're able to create these sort of very effective kind of baffles for light, and that becomes a really key element where we get light without, but maintain privacy for the kind of very close ways the houses are situated next to each other. And I think second kind of interlude in my lecture is a little bit about our approach to collaboration in architecture. We have a strong history of working with artists in our practice. Our first projects were in Marfa, Texas. And either through invitation or artists just being interested in our work, this next series of images is a selection from a book that we just published. This is an image by the artist Jack Pearson, and Jack uses the camera and a lot of other mediums, but what here he was doing was looking at kind of fragments of the building, capturing a certain kind of atmosphere by just bracketing very kind of specific moments that are of course quite abstract, but still evoke something about the building. Or in this case, this is the Italian photographer Luisa Lambri, and here she's creating a portrait of the Hill House, which is the first project I showed you. Just by focusing in on a very subtle corner of the house, looking at texture and light, she's able to sort of capture a delicacy and a sort of ephemerality about what otherwise is really a sort of very muscular and massive building. And this is another detail, or another one of her images of the house. Or James Welling, previously a professor at UCLA in the Fine Arts Department, now in New York. This is images of Porch House, which is a very massive cast-in-place concrete house where he was focusing on apertures and the sort of dissolution of the volume of the house through the way light filled these openings. And I think these images help us extend the dialogue about our design development and really become part of a continued conversation with artists and other friends, and in our case, were turned into a book. This is by the artist, Livia Corona, and she did a project called House for Sale. The house was for a couple called the Sales, and the house wasn't occupied when it was initially finished, so she created this whole sort of film about these looky-loos, these senior citizens that came and almost cast the house as a character in this film. So it was a really fun project that helped us, just think about what does it mean, empty house, what does it mean to occupy and dwell in a building beyond what we might typically think about. And then the Swiss photographer, Marianne Mueller, is an old friend of ours. She did what we call the extended cover of the book, and really sort of told a story of Los Angeles and our Los Angeles through a series of diptych images like these that kind of embed our project, which is this image on the right with kind of qualities and spaces in Los Angeles. So this work culminated in this book that was just published by Birkhauser and edited by Reto Geiser, a professor at Rice University. And for us, what was important about it was we had a lot of requests to do monographs, and we just felt it was too early in our career to do that. We wanted to create a book that would engage a conversation for us with our colleagues and people that are meaningful to us in our practice. And so it's organized around these portraits, some of which I just showed you, and then a series of conversations with historians, curators, fashion designer, that just give you insight into the kinds of questions that we're asking in our work. This is Veronica Kellendorfer looking at the Hill House in conversation with a series of images of the landscape of Catalina Island. And then it included a series of portfolio of drawings, and then a special insert by the artist Wally Beshti, who took on comic making software and captured a sort of very subtle part of our work that has to do with our interest in sort of anthropomorphism, and created this very fun, kind of funny story about putting all our buildings in conversation with one another. So here's some images just of the book. And this second chapter looks at, as I said, some of the buildings as we start to think about them not as singular objects, but as they begin to multiply. And here, this is probably the smallest and shortest duration project in our office. It was a room for a library, a building for a library, and I think it just captures something about our approach to form making and structure, which was, it had two very simple site conditions we needed to accommodate: a view towards a kind of small canyon, so a more vertical orientation, and then one towards a small lake. This was in Michigan, near University of Michigan. And so our approach was simply to orient those two windows, which are the gray rectangles, and then simply inscribe a curve and plan that would connect those two corners of those windows, and then the very same profile would form the figure of the roof. So instead of developing a complex surface, we took a very direct approach to describe the profile of the house, and then develop the form of the building as a result of that. So the complexity kind of builds up from very simple repetitive means as a way to define the volume of the house. So this is a kind of a special project for us. It was part of an earthquake reconstruction effort by the government in Chile after the 2010 earthquake. And we completed a project in 2008 that was, I'm not showing tonight, but it was organized by Ai Weiwei and Herzogenaurach. It was called the Ordos 100. Maybe some of you guys are familiar with that. But I think what was most important about that project is it triggered a whole set of collaborations between a group of architects of our generation that continues to sustain today. And I think that's a very different kind of practice than perhaps people in earlier generations. And so this project was curated by the Chilean architects Peza van Erlichhausen, and we were one of a group of 10 that were invited to design a pavilion that would first be perhaps a community center or a school, and then eventually would become an art, some kind of cultural program. So our site was in Penco, which is all part of this Biobío region, and it's a kind of beautiful bay, and our site was in a pine forest. And so there was both a commemorative sort of memorial nature to the building, and it also had a very pragmatic approach. And so the initial brief was relatively small, about 3,000 square feet. And so what we did, we were so moved by the kind of the form and vista of this bay, is we somehow used that figure, this kind of sweeping arc, to define the interior volume, which is what you see in the front of the model, and then multiplied that as a second space that would be oriented towards the sky. So by sort of duplicating the footprint, we create a prelude to entering the space and perhaps engage it more deeply into the atmosphere. So one room is towards the sky, and the interior space was towards the bay. So here are just a couple of model shots that give you that, help you understand how those two, where they meet, and a point of tangency is the entry, and then the support spaces are the service areas, and there's also now a lower level. But simply by pairing these two volumes and then inscribing the footprint of the building the most direct way, we were able to create this almost kind of bunker-like building that seemed almost impenetrable from a distance. But then as you approached it, you would have this one moment where you would see through the courtyard and out back into the ocean. But when you entered the courtyard, you had this very sort of direct relationship between the ground and the sky, which for us had a kind of primal, primitive quality to it, which seemed appropriate to mark that connection between ground and sky. The formwork is, again, it's not quite ready for construction, but the formwork will be cast-in-place concrete. It's a very rural area. Concrete, like in Argentina, is the kind of material of choice. And this scalloping that you see in the model will be made by, we're making molds using, we had to take away 6 pine trees, and so those are forming the molds to shape this outer, the walls of the inside of the exterior courtyard. And then on the interior of that space, the idea was to think, in contrast to the roughness of that exterior courtyard, a smooth, polished concrete that would subtly reflect the light and the view of that distant horizon, and hopefully in doing that kind of amplify, make you feel like you're sort of surrounded by that experience of the bay. So this is a model shot, but it gives you a sense of what we envision that space to be like. This has been through a lot of iterations. We're finalizing the project for a dance troupe. So this will be one of the main dance spaces, and then we've added a lower level that will be for other rehearsal space. And I think coming pretty much immediately after that was we were invited to participate in a biennial in Shanghai. This building was finished in 2013, and so it's right along the Bund, just south of the center part of the city. So we're occupying that little triangular lot. This whole area is being redeveloped for housing, and on that parcel just over the street, that sort of strange half-circle space, is a museum that David Chipperfield is currently developing. So this is a pretty old image, and so as a program, we needed to design a building that was incredibly flexible, that would accommodate the events of the opening biennial, but anticipate a lot of development and different kinds of cultural programming and perhaps events related to the development. So we call this the Pavilion with 6 views. So it's 6 volumes, 3 of which are oriented outward towards the city, and 3 that are oriented to form a kind of continuous space organized around a central courtyard that would bring light and allow for airflow and things like that. So I think being on a triangular lot, there was an interest in it being both compact, but having a sense of it filling that parcel and really embracing. There's a lot of public activities that happen on that triangle, so it has that kind of contrasting quality of being a singular volume and sort of spreading itself out. And at the same time, I think approximating some of the scale of the industrial building, some of which will remain. So it's all precast concrete. Mark was there around the opening for this building, and he was there probably 2 days before it was supposed to open, and he just walked away thinking, there's absolutely no way this building will be finished. And sure enough, 2 days later, and probably 1,000 workers, 24-hour days, the building was finished. And so the idea of light here was that we always had a pairing of this sort of picture window that really embraced the city, and it would be a sort of media space, and then a secondary source of light, which was the skylight. So those two kind of geometric maximum points were always illuminated. And recently, probably in the last year, the building was taken over by the Shanghai Center, or the International Center for Photography. So it's perhaps wasn't the best program to occupy the building, but they've made some really good modifications to help modulate light, and it's become a really successful sort of sister institution to the same partner program in New York. And this is the UCLA Graduate Art Studios building. So I think this building in the presentation marks a kind of important shift in scale, where it's a 55,000 square foot building, so it's not huge. But I think it has given us the chance. We won this competition in 2011, and just earlier this year, received the lead grant. So we're starting schematic design literally next Monday. So this is kind of feasibility work, but we developed it a bit more with the hopes of getting to where we are today. But it's for UCLA. It's their Graduate Art Studios building, but it's in Culver City. So this is a sort of famous area. Maybe I know some of you have traveled to LA with John. It's called the Hayden Track. So a lot of Eric Owen Moss work is in this neighborhood, and it's gone from a sort of very working industrial neighborhood to a very sort of boutique sort of loft-like space for Dr. Dre and people like that. So it's definitely a space in transition. But UCLA's been here since the mid-'80s, and it's got, basically what we're doing is preserving that big warehouse and removing all the other kind of ancillary buildings, and then developing the new campus. So here's kind of what it looks like today. And basically our approach, the building is for about 45 graduate art students who focus on 6 different disciplines. And so there's a lot of fluidity between program. So the first idea is to demolish everything but the warehouse, and then create this extended blue footprint, puts everything at one grade level. It's raised above grade 3 feet. So in a way, not dissimilar to some of the things that you guys were trying to do here. Create a continuity so all materials, all work can flow across one grade. And then wrapping the facade to the extent of the site, so we kind of capture that entire envelope of the building parcel, and then finally extend the language of the bow truss roof around the new volume or new program, so that we create this sort of continuous umbrella of covered space that we can have both interior and exterior space. So for us, we really envision the building and the kind of cluster of buildings underneath these roofs like a mini city. And so this diagram is just capturing house circulation, the main pinup spaces, which are in the center of the warehouse, the shops. The students had a real desire to have a garden, so we've introduced a garden that is also a space to exhibit sculpture. And one of the kind of key discussions that we've had, perhaps you guys did as well, is about finding a balance between determining the occupation of the building through architecture and holding back, leaving a kind of undetermined quality that would allow the students themselves to kind of begin to continue to occupy and transform the building through the installation of their work. So these are early model shots, but I think this is obviously we're right where we're going to be starting with ideas about the structure, but the general idea is to take this very almost generic vernacular of industrial buildings, that some of which are still left, and just find subtle ways through the way that we might, let's say, cantilever an element off of another, or just shift different relationships between the way structural elements and load paths might work to create kind of shift scale and suggest, in this case, the student entry. And I think also what was really interesting to us in this approach towards kind of underdetermining the landscape of the architecture, with the hopes of creating a really dynamic space for students and creative work, that we really want to think about how you can almost occupy the structure, that the kind of hierarchy of envelope and occupiable space was blurred. So you're almost nested within that structural landscape. Obviously, this is a great climate, Southern California. It's kind of has a lot of great offshore breezes. So one of the things that we were able to accomplish in adding this roof, which We don't know what the material is yet. We've been looking at different polycarbonates. So we have about 20,000 square feet of covered but unconditioned space. And so what that does for us is gives us a lot of room for the students to work without having to condition it. So this is a couple of images that capture the kinds of spaces that will exist underneath that roof, like the garden, the main circulation, what we call the arcade. This is a staircase to the upper level where the classrooms and some of the more finished digital studios and such will be. Center Bay is in the center of the main warehouse building, so it's kind of nestled within a neighborhood of studios as opposed to being a really formal room that you have to enter and with a door and such. And then one of the outdoor labs that's immediately adjacent to the machine rooms on either side, and then is immediately adjacent to the street. So it has, really functions in a lot like the flows of material that might happen in a city, but collapsed within one singular parcel. And I think that the idea of the roof is that it will kind of signify the school, especially at night. It'll be quite significant. It'll glow, but it doesn't have that more traditional kind of institutional feeling that you might see for a building like this if it were on a more traditional campus. And this project is a competition we won this year at the University of Chicago with the Theaster Gates runs a program called Arts in Public Life, which is a really interesting organization that brings together artistic practice with ideas about regenerating the south side of Chicago. And so this was an international competition for what is called the Green Line Arts Center. And so this is Washington Park, and we're just to the west of that. So the building is conceived. There are a number of, maybe some of you guys have been there. There's something called the Arts Incubator that Theaster finished a couple years ago, and these are some of the other buildings. The Stony Island Arts Bank that just opened, the Listening House, the Black Cinema House, buildings scattered around this neighborhood that make up this sort of loose, amorphous institution. So the Green Line Arts Center is immediately adjacent to the Green Line, which is this raised elevated train in Chicago. And it is immediately adjacent to the Arts Incubator and a really cool bookstore and cafe. And so the vision is really that this entire block will eventually be developed as a very vital kind of arts center for the community. And it's also notable because it's a really beautiful, very kind of traditional to this area, terracotta facade. So the two buildings adjacent to us are restored. And so in a way, we're going to redo that mask and insert a new building into that shell. So it's about a kind of 18,000 square foot performing arts building. So it has a black box theater, a film space, a number of dance studios. It's a very flexible building, but needs the ability to sort of expand and contract based on programming, which will be developed by a lot of the regional dance organizations that are very, very successful in this area. So in that way, we feel that our approach to the project was to really kind of fit in that sense by restoring the facade, and then introduce a new scale with the roof and the volumes of space in the building that could allow for the kind of larger scale kind of gatherings and performances that this building will accommodate. And at the same time, this is, for those of you that know the south side of Chicago, it's an incredibly kind of aggressive place that has a long tradition of violence. And one of the things that's fantastic about the work Theaster's doing, just simply with the Arts Incubator, is the kind of amount of community participation and the reduction in crime as a result of the work he's done already has been really measurable. And so for us, the idea also that traditional ideas about access, front and back, were really things that we challenged. So this is the back of the building, which abuts to really a nice neighborhood street, and figuring out how to make an architecture that is transparent and welcoming and is both institutional but something that isn't overpowering, doesn't say, you can't come here. So the roof profile is, establishes a new volume for the kind of double height spaces of the theaters, but also echoes a kind of almost factory-like scale of industrial buildings that is also in this area. And part of that was also allowed us to introduce a number of sort of winter garden-like spaces, which are both buffer zones, kind of not in a way performing unlike the way your stair does in this building, that create sort of environmental filters in the winter and the summer. They operate in different ways and introduce, of course, light into the space. So this is the section of the building, cinema going from left to right, the cinema space, a flexible winter garden / rehearsal room, the black box theater, and then a second kind of flexible space. And so the idea is that it can operate with many different programs happening simultaneously, from film, a meeting space, a dance, and maybe a community meeting on the south side, but we can also open it up and it can become one continuous kind of event space. So of course then transparency, kind of shifting scale and making the contents of this building visible was really important. So just subtle things about the way the storefront windows subtly shift scale were part of our strategy to try to embrace the neighborhood, make people feel welcome, and sort of project the life of the building out into the street. This is the rear facade, so in a way they sort of mirror one another, and in this case the brick is not historic, but it's recycled brick from some of the Astor's projects. So we're literally trying to build the building up out of that neighborhood. And then just a series of images looking through the building, kind of understanding this almost, again, like kaleidoscope-like way that it can open and close based on the way that programs are and are occupying the space at different times. And I think this idea we have about trying to understand our projects as, in a way, singular objects, but how they might engage the city was brought to bear, and kind of when we were asked to think about the larger block. And so, for example, here's the building. We looked at the idea of extending this roof so it could be a sheltered workspace in the wintertime, perhaps a performance space in the summer. And then the Astor was interested in how it might agglomerate and extend, so there could be, students could be building theater sets outside in covered areas. We took it pretty literally and kept going. But I think this kind of work is always really helpful in kind of producing artifacts that are challenging and help guide the discourse about projects like this that have so many stakeholders. So this is just a quick chapter in a way similar to the way that we work with artists and the work we did in our book. This is that Julia Schulman image, but we've also developed a whole portfolio of these collages. And this work happens at very different moments in our practice. Sometimes it's early on when we're really struggling to distill an idea, or other cases maybe at the end. But here, these are earlier images. This is the sale house where we were sort of collapsing the kind of issues of spatiality and depth, flatness and depth that we saw at work in Neutras Kaufmann House, or looking at the way that a building in the rounds is a project we are developing for a site in Italy, sort of superimposing that with Cascio del Fascio. But I think these kinds of images are, similar to the way we build models and other things, help us distill certain kind of key aspects of our project, and somehow by situating it in a context outside of ourselves, it both conceptually and literally helps us kind of understand our kind of core kind of position about these works. And so they're not, they extend the dialogue for us about the work. They're not meant to. There's a kind of sleight of hand in a way, in the way that we work with these important historic images or buildings, but have been really meaningful for us to communicate our work and engage perhaps people outside of our discipline as a way to understand what we do as architects more in a more refined way. And of course, images in architectural history, the work of Mies and his collages, and even contemporary art is something that's important to us, and film. So I wanted to share a few of these with you just to give you an understanding of, we're working, of course, very technically with our engineers and doing all of that work, but sometimes we just step back and we force ourselves to create images like this, which for us are in a way more evocative of a kind of singular idea than perhaps a rendering, things that, more and more we're asked to do in public or large institutional projects. But we find this kind of image making really powerful for what we can say and not say about the work we're doing. And for those of you that saw the biennial, this work was in the biennial last year, and so it included both the images from our book and this collage work. So I hope all of you guys will be able to come back next fall. It'll open in mid-September. So last chapter, 3 museum projects. We've spent a lot of our early years of our practice outside of Los Angeles. Unfortunately, we've been able to now come back and begin to work on some larger institutional buildings in LA. In this case, a kind of feasibility and master plan for the Museum of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles, which is which was the first cultural building in downtown Los Angeles, part of the master plan at Bunker Hill. So the white rectangle is the museum, and then that's Grand Avenue. And so this is a building of Arata Isesaki from the mid-'80s. And when it was designed, it was really a kind of lone sort of marker on this hill. And I think it's, it's made up of these very sort of primitive figures that are clustered like a still life on this beacon that was at the top of Bunker Hill, all clad in an Indian limestone. And it had a lot of, it was conceived of because in Los Angeles, whenever you have a new development, there's always a % for art that has to be allocated. And the developers and the cultural community had the intelligence to say, let's pool all of that money and build a museum instead of a bunch of lobbies filled with art. But that, as a result, put a lot of pressure on this building. It had to be below grade. There was no mechanical equipment that could be visible. And so it's a museum that you enter from above and go down. So it has a lot of really significant challenges for kind of the public nature of the building. So here's just a couple images of it today. And these images for us, these are Isasaki's original competition images, which really tell a story for us about how he saw Los Angeles, how he saw this building, this almost de Chirico-esque abstraction, the importance of light and shadow, and the way that they played off these forms. And here was the finished building. I mean, literally, it was a building, there was a raised street, and then these sort of berms of earth were what defined the space around the building. So it really was an island. And it was part of a master plan, which was partially realized, but there were some kind of key parts of it that were not. So here is the original sort of 1987 drawing of that we remade. And then here is pretty much what it is today. So that's MoCA, the Colburn School for Music, this building, this is the Broad, maybe you guys have visited, and then the Disney Concert Hall is just off the slide. So on the one hand, it's become a really vital street for culture, but unfortunately, a lot of the programming around MoCA specifically never was realized. So the sort of publicness of that space behind the museum was not realized, and so it has a real vacancy and sense of kind of lack of definition about it. So here's kind of an aerial of almost how it is today. This is probably a year ago or so. So if this is kind of our adaptation of Isasaki's drawing, we began to sort of superimpose that on today's context and try to figure out how we can still go back to that core essence of what Isasaki's team was thinking about, but understand it within the context of the city today. And so, unfortunately, there's been lots of attempts to give more definition to the building through bigger and bigger and bigger signs, canopies, different sort of appendages that have perhaps kind of diffused the impact of the building. So I'm going to go through a couple of images now which capture where we are in this sort of late feasibility stage. So this is the image of the main entry space of the museum is a raised plaza that then sort of spills out into this not very nice pedestrian walkway. And so our first move is to, in fact, define that as a room. We introduce a wall. So almost building more connection through creating a separation between the plaza and the space around it, so that the building takes on more presence as a space and a courtyard, and perhaps also the sky becomes more present, that the towers are sort of put back in the distance, and the sense of arrival is more clear. So here we are back now out at the street where there's kiosks and different accessibility elevators that were really confusing and not welcoming. And now we open that space up. So we're really trying to extend the space of the city, the sidewalk, into a very generous stair and ramp so that everybody is sort of moving together, and create more definition here, introduce art into those spaces. Now we're on the other side of, up on the plaza again, looking back towards the street. Later, after the building was finished in the mid-90s, Isasaki designed this canopy, which created even more kind of separation between the upper plaza and the lower plaza where you actually enter the museum. So we proposed to remove that, expand this commercial space below into a really great bookstore, which it is today, but make it even bigger, and then create a sort of richer and more urban plaza below. So here's that space now. We're down in that lower plaza, and it's now filled with light. There's more sort of interest and integration between the entry to the museum and the entry to the bookstore. And then finally, the entry to you'll now buy your ticket. This was really a space that was cut off. And I think for us, more and more museums we work on, the idea of a sort of journey and movement through the building is really an essential part of understanding how to design a museum. So if currently this space where you enter really cuts off all of that fluidity and visible connection, now the way that we've reorganized those program pieces, it's all about visual connection and physical connection at the same time. So this is then the entry to the galleries, which are actually quite fantastic. but now we've really put more primacy on defining the entrance to the galleries and the circulation space. So here we are, existing condition, remove these elements, simple kind of almost acupuncture-like insertions, which give it much more definition. And then finally, we've been looking at, once we re-envision the public space of the museum, what would it mean to add gallery space? And I think this obviously is good for the museum, but it also kind of intensifies the definition of that public space, the courtyard, which is also a real benefit for the museum. So this is the MCA. This is a project we've been working on for the past 2 years. It's going to start construction next month. And I think Chicago is a great city for art because it's built up on the tradition of the museum and the park. So museum and landscape is always thought of together. This is Lakeshore Park, so it's a little bit north of the other institutions, and Michigan Avenue is just right here. So it's a little bit off Michigan Avenue. And it was, the existing building was designed by Joseph Paul Kleihues in the finished in 1996. And so the building is, I mean, I would say it's probably, it's a pretty good space for art, but it's an incredibly sort of brutal space for public. It's a really challenging building for a lot of reasons. But it also has this incredible situation where it's sitting, and unlike perhaps the other museums in Chicago, it's sitting in this urban canyon with a lot of university buildings on the south side and tall residential towers on the north. So it has this incredible access to the lake. It's contiguous with the lake, but it's very hemmed in and tight, unlike all the other parks. So here's just a couple orientating views. That's the facade of the building. And I think, I'm not going to go into this project too deeply, but I think hopefully you guys will have the chance to see this when you come to Chicago for the next biennial, but a lot of good intentions. Kleihues was fascinated with the idea of a museum as a station, almost literally as a train station, as a space you pass through, a space to experience art. But there were a number of kind of key, let's say, design decisions that perhaps precluded that from really happening. One was the kind of height of the building, how high it is raised off the ground. It really feels monumental and not welcoming. The base, the plinth as we call it, the lower level, was supposed to be the public space, but because it's so solid and hard to understand where you enter, it doesn't create that kind of continuity with the city. And conversely, on the rear side, through a lot of sort of hard to understand decisions, it's a beautiful terrace, but it's cut up by circulation and various things, so it doesn't have that sort of sense of grandeur and civicness that you'd expect. So we were working both on a master plan for the museum, and then we're starting with phase 1 this month. And so first, figuring out how to create more continuity and fluidity with the city was of kind of primary importance at the urban scale. And then looking at the block scale, trying to understand how both program and architecture, we could create more connection to the city, both through access, visibility, things like that. And then on the interior, looking at how we could improve circulation. So worked a lot with models, literally understanding how the museum worked in terms of circulation. So if that was before, this is the after, where the existing theater and theater lobby are now adjacent. If before that was sort of this dead end that was completely disconnected from the public life of the theater, now we have relocated the restaurant, we've amplified public program along what we're calling a street, and then we've added a stair that you can see in the top of the image, which will connect you to a new public space called a common. So instead of a dead end, now we create continuity in about 10,000 square feet of public space that can be open when the museum is not open. On the main museum floor, a lot of kind of dead ending and backtracking. Now we introduce another stair, so the kind of symmetry of the plan is now realized both in space and organization and how you move through the building. And then in section, this is the existing section coming up the street, up those monumental stairs, and you come into a sort of very multi-story, 4-story atrium. But it's in fact almost overscaled for the nature of the building. And so our project will introduce 2 new floors on the east and west atriums that creates a more intimate space on the ground floor, and then provides more program, which was a key part of what they needed to do. So here's that new 3rd floor as it is today. And then we're creating kind of 2 new bridges that will connect north to south and on the west, and then create a new education floor on the east. So here's those existing spaces that are huge and echoey, and then this is this kind of diagram of what they will be like when we're finished. So this was our contribution to the one of our contributions to the biennial last year, which was really fun because this is literally a life-size mock-up of what our building, part of our project, which was to introduce a new floor. The space of this grid is the height and depth of the new floor that we'll introduce. And it's been a pretty fantastic thing because I think it's helped the museum understand this new scale, and it's been really successful. So this project was called A Grid is a Grid is a Grid, and it was really trying to expose some of the idiosyncrasies of the Clyhus grid, which was very strict and rigid, but through a lot of some interesting circumstances had to be shrunk and offset in the evolution of the design. So that's what this project was looking at. So here is a model of existing condition, first part of the project, and then this is what will be built in phase one. It's about a 20,000 square foot renovation and addition within the building. And then we began to also look at the master plan, at the larger building as it sits in the landscape and the possibility of adding art space. So this is the existing museum. And in a way similar to MoCA, we take an approach where we make the building more accessible and porous through almost fortifying the edge of the building even more. And what we believe that does is creates more intimate spaces for the stair, it creates more platforms for art, and sort of breaks down that monumentality a little bit more. So if this is the existing condition, some sketches of what that might look like. There would be much more space for art, more visibility, more sort of porosity, both literally and visually, physically, in terms of access and visibility. And then on the back side of the building, the east side, this is the existing condition today. And what we would propose to do is reorient all the circulation to create a much more grand civic space, which in a way sort of mirrors the stair on the west side, but a more sort of generous and subtle gradient, so that they have great parties here in the summer, music venues and things like that. And then we also began to think about how you would add on to this building. And so we began to look deeply into the sort of DNA of the Clyhus grid and the planning of that building, and began to look at how we could both add art space, but also develop a kind of idea of space in a winter garden that would be a public space that would welcome people from the park and be a sort of interstitial space between the museum and the rest of the city. So these are just very conceptual diagrams of what this master plan might look like. And so this is that winter garden. And so this is the existing museum, and this is what we envision with a little bit of Photoshop and a little bit of moving away of tennis courts, that we could have a landscape like that. And I think that, for us really fulfills and helps us situate the MCA within. This is just a map of how those museums in Chicago, kind of the different scales of those green spaces within the city. And the last project I wanted to share with you is the Menil Drawing Institute. This building has been under construction for about a year and a half, and will open to the public next September. So it's in the museum district of Houston. And we were part of a competition. In 2012, the finalists were ourselves, Chipperfield, Sejima, Sana, and Tatiana Bilbao. And so this was the existing condition that we were given in the competition. So that building on the upper left is, of course, Renzo Piano's Menil collection from 1987. The Twombly Pavilion is the square building. The Rothko Chapel is there. Byzantine Chapel by François de Menil, and then the Dan Flavin building is here. And so this is also part of the Menil campus, although it was an apartment building that has since been torn down. But it's about a 30-acre parcel. And for those of you that have not been, just to say that it's a really magical place because it's filled with amazing art, but it's nested within a landscape of pre-war bungalows that really make it feel like you're just in a neighborhood and come upon these great museum buildings. So the kind of sense of scale and intimacy is really remarkable. So here's just a kind of catalog of the Menil collection building, and then these sort of satellites that make up the kind of necklace of art buildings nested within the bungalows. And what's important to know about the Menil collection buildings is that all of them make use of light from above. You guys are all probably familiar with the great leaves of Renzo's building in the upper left. But all of these buildings in different ways are notable for the way they manage light. And so for us, that was the challenge because we were developing a building for drawings, which has a very different requirement technically. So in addition to the main buildings, the open spaces are really fantastic, and they're punctuated by great works of art. There's a large collection of Michael Heiser's work. which are these kind of inscriptions in the ground, Tony Smith. And then finally, this fabric of these pre-war bungalows, most of which are owned by the Manil and have been unified simply through painting them all the same color gray and white trim. So there's something, you have a sense that there's some institutional nature to the place, but it isn't through signage or traditional tropes you might see on a campus. And then that very last, most ephemeral layer is the landscape of oak trees that create this kind of great atmosphere of shade and shadow and kind of as a foil to the buildings. So for us, the Drawing Institute is about 30,000 square feet. And as such, I think it really, for us, occupied a space between a traditional museum building like the Manil Collection and the Philip Johnson House, which was the house that the Manils commissioned to live in as a family in Houston. And that kind of in-between scale was something that fascinated us because of the small scale nature of the drawings that we were going to be housing. And I think part of that also, what was key in the house, Philip Johnson House, which is this image on the right, that Renzo carried through in the Manila Collection building was the idea of the courtyard as both a kind of space for light, a space, a visual space that connected the interior to the exterior, especially in Houston where it's really hot a lot of the year, so you can't always be outside, but really putting those two things together, art and garden. So here is the master plan. David Chipperfield did a master plan for the Manil, and this is one of the early drawings for that, and this was the kind of final plan. So tearing down the main apartment building, redeveloping the south end of the campus along a new rail line. And then the first building it was determined the first building would be the Drawing Institute, which is essentially this square. And what's notable to see it in this drawing is that it's literally in the geographic center of the campus. And so for us, in the fact that the new phase in our project will open up the whole southern part of the campus, it sort of put a different kind of weight on the programmatic definition of this building. It's a drawing institute, it has scholars, museum visitors, conservators, but it also is really a living room for the entire campus, and that was kind of important to us as we developed the program. So here, this is kind of an existing condition once the apartments were torn down, and what was notable about that is when Dominique bought that large apartment building, she had the good sense to plant trees when they first bought it. So now what we're largely retaining is a series of oak trees that were part of the courtyards of those buildings. And so our conceptual idea was literally to create rooms around those trees that were entry spaces, and then the building would kind of fill in itself around those courtyards, which become rooms and entry spaces and contemplative spaces, almost like cloisters in a more kind of scholarly context. And then on the inside, our conceptual idea was to think about, given this kind of in-betweenness between a museum and a house, to think about the small-scale rooms that would occupy this building in a way as a kind of mimicking the scale of the building surrounding the MDI. And then all of that is unified by a large roof, which creates shade and covers the gardens and such. We worked with Guy Nordenson as our structural engineer, and Michael van Valkenburg was the landscape architect. So here, what was kind of one of the most challenging parts of the building are the courtyards, which eventually have been developed as plate steel roof planes and wall planes. So it's, in this case, for example, in this roof here, this is a 60-foot span, and it's a half-inch steel plate with just rib structure. So there's a lot of pretty complex engineering going on, but it has a it's like look no hands. It doesn't show how the structure is working, and for us that's always a kind of important quality of sort of conditions of contrast that I've talked about a little bit. So as a kind of conceptual collage, the idea was that this extended roof would capture the canopy of trees, create this kind of halo of shadowy space around this relatively small building, and just fold itself in and out of the trees as a way to create a room, a kind of new porch for the campus at the Manil. So just to orient you with the way the courtyards work. So you enter on the east and west on the south side of the building through a courtyard, and then the third courtyard is the scholar courtyard, which is part of the staff area of the building. So here's the existing condition as we found it, and here will be the final, in the next year, you'll see the Drawing Institute. We're also doing the new energy plant, which is here. We're creating a new garden, and then Michael and his team are creating a new park. So circulation was, of course, very key on the Manila campus, and unlike maybe more traditional campuses, which are very axial and sort of you can see where you're going from hundreds of feet ahead of you, there's what was kind of genius about the planning of the original buildings is that there was a kind of oblique, off-centered axis idea. So instead of entering Twombly along the main street across from the Manila collection, you come into the garden and then enter. So we extended that idea and so that one could literally pass through a garden through the center of the MDI and pass right out, pass right through it, and so that it's very generous in that way about sort of not creating a boundary. It's made up of 3 very simple program pieces, a gallery, an administration piece, and a study center, which includes a drawing room and the conservation lab, and then the gardens, the courtyards, they're surrounded by the courtyards. Light was a key part of this project. We worked with George Sexton from Washington, D.C. as the lighting designer, and from the very beginning, we knew that part of the benefit of extending the building out into the landscape through these courtyards was that we would be able to lower the light levels starting way outside of the gallery spaces. So you start at the upper left on the top, 10,000-foot candles, and simply through the way the building, the trees, and the courtyard roofs extend out, we're able to move from 10,000-foot candles to 5 without any kind of artificial buffering or it's simply through the way the roofs work, the way the windows are placed, that you have that fluidity, and we avoid what's called a matinee effect. So you never, even though that's a very dark space, you'll never have that sense of transitioning from something really bright to something really dark. So from the south, the building feels quite sort of opaque, and it simply almost feels like a sculpture in the landscape with this porch to the south. Then moving closer to the building, looking north, you start to see the garden, the sort of entry courtyard. Working with Michael, we complemented the existing oak trees with new oaks. And so the canopy of the building and the canopy of the trees work together to create this sort of shadowy space, but at the same time affording views into the entry to the building on the diagonal. And then on the opposite courtyard, a slightly more almost domestic scale to the plantings. And that same diagonal, you can enter the building and you'd see through to the scholar courtyard. The living room is a space that we sort of invented in the program, which helped us, instead of having lots of corridors that sort of served only one purpose, we consolidated all of the primary circulation in the building into the space. So it's both a lobby in the more traditional sense, it's where all scholars and visitors can meet, it's the entry to the galleries, and it's a meeting space. And so it sort of does all those things within a very intimately scaled atmosphere. So I think here you can also see the geometry in the way that was working in the courtyards, which kind of made a space that connected you to the ground. Here those same geometric elements are lofted and create a more vaulted-like space, which is the living room. The galleries are tuned specifically for drawings. It's a 12.5-foot ceiling, so it's exactly calibrated for the kind of approximate general scale of the kinds of works that it will be exhibited here. And what's important for us is that even in the drawing space where the light levels are that low, you always have vistas back out into the garden. So you're always connected back to the outside. This is the scholar courtyard, a different scale of tree. This will be a circulation space, a contemplative, quiet meeting space that has one of the great traditions of the Manila is that the working spaces where staff and art are always sort of made visible to visitors. So I think that was a key part of how we organized the space. And this is the drawing room, the real center of the museum, the one space where drawings and natural light come into contact through this central skylight and these side skylights. So it's really a kind of, it's an instrument-like space, but with very simple means we can calibrate and create sort of about 15 different lighting scenarios from no natural light to full light. And then as a compendium to that is the conservation library. When you're studying drawings and working with drawings, conservation is always part of that. So these rooms are thought of as a kind of pairing with similar kinds of light and scale of space. And then zooming back out, I think what was important for us is to create a building that from some perspectives felt almost at the scale of the house, which is this west view where you're looking into the living room and the entry, and it feels simply like a cluster of pavilions. And that kind of in-between quality is something that we always strive for in different ways in our work, sort of between building and landscape, inside and outside, in between scale, and it was particularly appropriate for us for this building. And so here, just to close, we're looking at scale. So this is the Manila collection. I think what's important if you look at the buildings in this way and this drawing technique is that you start to see the kinds of principles that are at work in all of the buildings. A sort of cluster of gallery, the way the courtyard is a defining element of the Manila collection of Renzo, of the Philip Johnson House, which is here, and then this is the Drawing Institute. So it gives you a sense of the way that our building sort of sits as an in-between scale on the campus, as well in plan and in section. So this is the Drawing Institute, which is just approximates the height of the surrounding bungalows. So it, even in its scale and plan and section, it's straddling that kind of in-between condition. Let's see if this will work. This is just a short film that kind of situates you a little bit more on the campus. This is from the Manila Collection building looking south, and that's the Twombly building. For the west view, the entry. I don't know if there's any sound. I don't know if we got that part to work, but it's not a big deal. So now this is the west courtyard looking towards the entry. Now you're in the living room space. On the floor, crawling on the floor. And now you're looking south into the gallery. So the galleries are on the south because we essentially couldn't have any light in them. So the workspaces and the conservation lab are on the north side. Now we're in the scholar courtyard. So that's the kind of a work and seating space on the left, and we're in the galleries on the right. And then that's the drawing room. And the galleries. We introduced 2 windows on the east and west side that can be covered, but gives us the opportunity in certain cases to have views out from the gallery too. Surrounding the drawing room are salons, which you just saw in the image on the left. This is the conservation library looking towards the conservation lab, which is on the north side of the building. In the drawing room. And now we're on the east side of the building looking at the courtyard there, which is a little more wild, a little more, you don't walk through it in the same way that you do the other side. Now we're on the south side of the building, what we call the porch. And then this is from the new park on the south. And that's the end of the lecture. Thank you.
About your design process. There are 2 kind of counterintuitive aspects of your process, which I think are really interesting. The first has to do with the way you seem to move from models to diagrams. I think students often assume that we start with a diagram and then we make it real or physicalize it, materialize it.
Right.
And you don't work in that way. Intentionally, it seems, turning it on its head. The other thing has to do with the distinctive quality of the work. One would think that it's a kind of virtuoso operating in isolation, designing away, kind of imposing a kind of look on the world. But in fact, you're really collaborating with a wide array of designers, artists, and fabricators, and engineers, and other architects, and clients, and contractors, et cetera, and it's not just lip service. Everyone talks about collaboration.
Right.
Talk a little bit more about how you actually integrate feedback and other kinds of networks, or curate, in fact, that network of collaborators.
Right.
Because students, they kind of think of themselves as operating in isolation, and when they do collaborate, it's with fellow studio mates.
Right.
So just,
Yeah, sure. I think that's a good subject to talk about in this setting. So I'll start with the second question. I think it's true that, of course, all architects, we have to all collaborate. Once you are starting to build buildings, you have a lot of consultants, and so that's just a matter of course. But I would like to think that we try to kind of go a little bit deeper in that process. And I feel like of the work I shared today, perhaps the Drawing Institute is a good example where, we always try to we try to make the most with the least. I would say that's an approach. For example, for the Drawing Institute, we were really insistent, just given the kind of simplicity and elemental quality of the ethos of the Manil, that we didn't want to have a lot of, let's say, technical systems to modulate light, because we just felt that the Manil would never maintain it, they couldn't afford it, and it was just not part of the sort of historic ethos of that place. So we knew that we had to really dig in deep and get with our consultants, which was the landscape architects, Michael and his team, and Guy and George, and roll up our sleeves and figure out how we were going to solve this lighting problem by looking at the problem of light for a museum, 100 yards outside the building. And I think that helped us, ultimately it helped us really simplify the way the building functioned, but it was incredibly complicated to think it through, to design those roofs so we could actually get the spans that we wanted, integrate them with the trees. I mean, we're spending weeks right now working on logistics of how the trees and the roof are going to get installed. I mean, we're meshing things together in ways that are, in a way, make it more complex, but ultimately, once they're built, will allow for less reliance on technology and more making use of the natural kind of phenomena, let's say the trees, to do a lot of work for us. And so I think that's not always easy to do. I think we're always challenged by let's get it faster and do it with cut budgets and cut fees and all these things. But I think we as architects really have to kind of establish martial law as much as we possibly can to make arguments for how we want to practice and how we want to make use of the intelligence of our team. I think we always we really have a lot of respect for the engineers that we work with and the artists that we work with, and we try to cultivate a kind of dialogue both amongst our team and with our clients, that it's not just about servicing you by delivering something, but it's about striving for the most that we can with the least amount of resources. And I think the other work, like the work on the book, let's say, or the collage work, or the sort of, I didn't show a number of projects that we've done, installations, or the design of objects with artists that are, I think also a way to, we see our work as really part of a much larger continuum. I mean, we try to measure our work up against history. We think about innovation as something that is building on something came before us, and if it's good, it'll be relevant for many years to come. And so for us, having that exchange, embedding our work in a larger kind of critical discourse is how we challenge ourselves. We're not interested in the heroic idea of us as authors, but really about building up a kind of richness in the way that we look at our work, both in the process and even when it's finished, because that's what will fuel the next project. And I really encourage you guys. I mean, I think I mentioned that we are part of a network of architects that came from Ordos. It's in Chile. We're doing, we bring colleagues to teach with us. And I think that some of your greatest allies in your careers are probably sitting with you right now. And I think, having a lot of respect, you two guys right here, having a lot of respect for, what each other are doing and thinking about how you can collaborate. You don't have to be partners, but we're faced with so many different kinds of projects, and sometimes certain expertise is really what we need. And I think being nimble that way is really important. Perhaps that's a segue to the other part of your question, which is tools, I think. If I were to zoom out a little bit from what exactly you asked. And I think it's right. I mean, we certainly do diagrams along the way, but for us, sometimes the collages as well. I mean, I think as you're designing a building, I mean, even as you all are where you are in school, I mean, buildings get incredibly complex very fast. And we always are looking for ways to distill our understanding of what we're doing, not to simplify, but to find a kind of essence of a set of relationships. And for us, the diagrams are partly about doing that. Sometimes they're about generative, they're helping us understand where we want to go, and other times they're about looking backwards and understanding. So I feel that that's also important, that we don't see our work, our process in a linear way. We're always creating feedback loops for how we work. And I think that's important because inevitably, work you're doing today at one scale is going to inform what you do when you're going to be doing, big towers or big museums. And so having that ability to shift scale, shift tools, we feel is really important to help us remember what we know in a way.
With your work, has there ever been an exploration of an offer
I think it's a good question. I think the notion of aperture is something that really fascinates us, both as a kind of, for all the obvious reasons about visibility and light and things, and it's of course also a point of access. And perhaps for UCLA, that will be something that's important to us because it's somehow, it's perhaps a more humble building, but it has the requirements to operate at a more and also have a kind of intimacy of just people entering the building. So it could be. I think that we haven't had the opportunity for, looking at that kind of technology for windows and doors, but it's always interesting, and I think that's a good example of where he did that really, really well in terms of kind of complex technology. Oh, great. Great.
I've been to that site quite a bit, and actually being able to sign that used to get a student project.
Yeah, it's a great place to do a student project.
So that kind of leads me to just a couple of questions. And I guess one is, it's really interesting seeing the whole range of work. I never thought this word would come out of my mouth in recent years. This work is canonical in a way that I mean that in kind of a complimentary way, but also in kind of a questioning way. We seem to be in an era where we're sort of questioning type. If you see the image type, the whole goal is diagram of disruptive nature, yet it seems like you're being more into aspects of continuity through the representation by using us here as a canonical image, sort of your way. It doesn't seem to be kind of dicey with deconstruction. It seems to be pointing to the image. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that in terms of continuity versus disruption. How do we progress while at the same time connect to history? And then my next question is this, which I think is, I never thought I'd live this long to ask the question, how do you renovate post-modernity? Even the projects you are doing are, each of these
Yeah.
projects kind of.
It's true, they're all three of the same decade.
Yeah, and it's very interesting that I never thought that the 1980s would
Right.
be absorbed into the art direction. The Isazaki building is, I was a terrible person, and I just wonder, I wonder that, and the decline rate is hard to love. I think even when it's done, it's hard to love.
I would agree.
How do you renovate
Yeah.
modernity
Yeah.
within that framework?
I think it's a good question, and it's interesting that the way you frame the first part of the question, I think, gets at some of the themes that we're going to be looking at in the biennial next year, because I do think there's a group of architects around the world, both in the United States and Europe, let's say, and that are perhaps rejecting ideas of innovation for heroic form making as a practice, and I think are looking back to history as a way to it's not in a postmodern way, but in a way that looks at continuity of practice of ideas as a way to sustain their work and to kind of build a connection to the city, to the fabric of places that we're building in ways that perhaps, those generations just ahead of us perhaps rejected. And I think that, we also, a lot of our friends in Europe, let's say, these architects are not getting the chances to build museums. They're doing schools, they're doing agricultural sheds, they're doing very, very pragmatic buildings. And I would say that, we're probably somewhere in between that. But we find that like looking at people and projects that are innovating through understanding where they've come from is incredibly provocative and meaningful at this point in time, given the decades of the 90s and the 2000s. And so I think the way we work, the kinds of mediums, the way you referenced some of the image making that we do is about that. I mean, I think we recognize that, 99% of the buildings around us are background fabric buildings. And if we can build those, if we can get our hands on those buildings, we would live in a much better looking environment. And so I think part of it is strategic. It's like, okay, how can we think about buildings that we make? They're still object buildings, but they're rooted in an understanding of the urban fabric in a way that's very different. It's about creating connection, even within a small building object, and that helps inform certain kinds of decisions that would be very different if we were solely thinking about innovation in form and technology in isolation. And I feel like your second question is a really good one, but I feel it would be something more for a critic to answer than myself. But I appreciate it because I think it's right that we're at a certain distance from postmodernism, that we can, it's time to renovate those buildings, and it's forcing us to ask questions about the validity and the sort of historic legacy of a lot of that work. And it is pretty fascinating that we are working. I mean, Manila is a standalone building, but it's working within a context of mid-'80s buildings that are all, in very different cities, but of almost the exact same time frame. So I hope in a year's time you guys will be able to debate that. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's great that you know about Isasaki's work. I think this, in our opinion, it's one of his better buildings. I think. So I think it's right. I mean, as I understood what you said, a kind of schizophrenic realism. I mean, you talked about some sort of poetic terms that perhaps he has used to talk about his work. And I mean, I think for us, for what it's worth, we generally like the building. We think that it creates a kind of distinctly LA feeling, this open courtyard, the way that it connects to the street, the sort of casualness of how you enter that building. And I mean, in not dissimilar ways, although we think the Clayhouse building in Chicago is much tougher, I think a lot of reasons why we've been selected to do these projects is probably because we are students of history. We recognize that to be successful in these kinds of projects, especially in the kind of first phases of renovation, I mean, to try to overcome these buildings with a contemporary response is just probably really futile. So trying to distill the essence of this almost Akiriko-esque abstraction of the Isesaki building was really fascinating to us, and we thought the material palette was really beautiful. So it was about trying to find those kind of primitive conditions of that building and work with them. Even the Hill House, the very first project I showed you, I think a lot of times our work tends to find, not necessarily like a path of least resistance, but find a kind of through line that we can amplify something we like and turn it into something else, as opposed to working against an existing condition, which, given the projects that the idea of doing additions or renovations, I mean, it's a very different proposition than doing a new building.
Okay, please
Okay.
join us
That's nice. Thank you so much for that reflection. Yeah, thank you. All right, thanks you guys for coming. It was great to see you. Yeah.
Thank you.